Welcome to another episode of Mexican in the Kitchen. I'm going to start this recipe by making something we call Caldillo. Caldillo is a very thin tomato sauce, very simple, very easy to make, but it has a really nice flavor. We use it in a lot of Mexican dishes, and it's a really nice extra for this dish. For that, I have some boiling water. I'm going to use half a kilo of tomato. My pot is on a 4 out of 6, so medium-high fire. I'm going to make sure the water covers all of the tomatoes, and I'm going to leave it there for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. This time might depend on where you live, on your pot, on your stove, but it's very simple to realize when these tomatoes are ready. After a while, you will notice tomatoes are really soft and the skin is almost coming off by itself. At this point, our tomatoes are ready and I'm going to throw them into the blender. If you don't happen to have a blender, or maybe you don't have a lot of time, or you're just lazy and want to skip this step, you could always use some pre-made tomato puree. You can skip the blending and continue with the video, just adding the water and the seasoning I use. If I'm cooking just for myself during the week, I'm going to take shortcuts, make it quite quick and simple. But if I cook during the weekend or I cook for someone else, I like to take my time, make it from scratch. I just prefer that kind of flavor. In the blender I have the tomatoes, 2 garlic cloves, 1 cup of the water I boiled them in, and some people would add half an onion, but I skipped this time. As I said before, you could skip all these steps and pour some tomato puree, but you would miss this bright red color and you would miss the opportunity to just make your own sauce from scratch and modifying it to your taste. I'm going to strain my sauce because it's a caldillo, it's not a proper sauce, so I don't want it to be thick at all. I want it to be quite runny and quite thin. I like to rinse my blender with a bit of water, just make sure I get all of the tomato from there and then pour it in here. Here, now we need to help our sauce to go through. This will make it way quicker. Just take a spoon, move everything around. If you follow my videos, you already know that my blender is not the best. That's why you might see a couple pieces of the garlic there. At the end, you will get this pulp. It's all left over. It's a bit of everything that the blender couldn't blend properly. My pot is still on a 4 out of 6, so medium-high fire. I'm going to leave it like that for a while, and I'm going to start seasoning. For seasoning, I'm adding some coriander. If you don't like coriander, you can always change it for some parsley, or even some epazote if you have. I'm adding also 1 jalapeno. I made 4 cuts just to get the most out of the flavor, but if you want to use some other kind of chili, or something that has a bit more kick, like a cuaresmeño for example, then you can also use that. I'm also adding some water, about half a liter. And don't worry if you think that's a lot of water or it will be a bit too mild, because we can always correct those things by just boiling it a bit and reducing. I'm adding a cube of chicken stock. If you don't want to use chicken, you can also use some vegetable one. If you don't want to use any of these cubes, you can just add a bit more salt. I'm using some salt. Personally, I like to use this kind of salt. It has some vegetables in it. It has a really nice flavor. But if you don't have this kind of salt or you don't want to use it, you can also use a regular one. Right now I'm mixing everything. I'm going to send it to the back of the stove, having it on a 2 out of 6, so low fire. I'm going to keep an eye and stir from time to time. By the time our spinach patties are ready, then our caldillo should be ready as well. But if you notice it's reducing a bit too fast, then you can always cover it and turn it off. For the patties, I'm starting with a bit larger pot. It's on a 4 out of 6, so medium-high fire. I already have some water, it's close to boiling. I'm using 1 kilo of frozen spinach. The main reason why I'm using frozen spinach is because it's usually pre-cooked, so it won't reduce as much. You could follow this recipe with fresh spinach, just wash it, chop it, boil it like I'm doing now. Most likely you will need way more than a kilo. Also, here in Finland, this frozen spinach is a way cheaper option. Right now, all we want to do is to defrost it, so I'm going to cover my pot. I'm going to turn the stove down to a 3 out of 6. After about 10 minutes, this should be completely defrosted, and we can continue with our recipe. For that, we are going to strain our spinach. We're only interested in the pulp. This process is quite simple. I'm using a regular strainer. I'm just going to pour everything in there, and there will be some left over in the pot. You can use some water to remove it and pour it back into the strainer. This is quite hot, so be careful. I'm leaving it here for a while, give it some time to cool down, and we can continue doing some other stuff. I have a pan on a 4 out of 6, so medium-high fire. I'm going to add a bit of canola oil, and I chopped half a large onion. I'm going to throw that in here as well. I'll just move it around, and after a while you will notice how the onion starts to get this kind of see-through color. At that point our onion is ready, and then we can set it aside and we'll use it later. Now that we gave it some time to cool down, we can continue with this recipe. For that, we have to remove as much liquid as we can. First, I'm going to start with a spoon. I'm just going to press this and try to remove as much water. You can see there's quite a lot of liquid coming. The spoon will let us move the spinach around, make sure it cools down, remove also some liquid, but after a while, we still need to use our hands. Using our hands will make it way easier, way faster, and as you can see, there's still quite some liquid there. This step is quite important because if you leave too much liquid in there when you start forming your patties, the liquid will just make your patties fall apart. Just try to remove as much liquid as you can and then we can continue. I will mix everything in a large bowl. I'm going to start with my spinach. I'm going to add the half an onion we cooked before. I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of sour cream or creme fraiche. I'm adding 175 grams of cheese. I'm using the kind of cheese I would put on top of a pizza. You can use anything as long as it melts nicely. I will also add 3 eggs. I'm going to finish this by adding 3 tablespoons of all-purpose flour. If you notice your mix is a bit too runny, you might correct with an extra tablespoon. At this point you can also add some salt, but in my case the cheese I used has a bit of salt, so I didn't want to add too much. Once everything is mixed, then we can start making our patties. Once our mix is ready, we're going to take some of it with our hands. We are going to round it, just as you would do with any meat hamburger. Just press it a bit. You don't want to press it too tight. You want to make it roundish. You want to make it a bit even. You don't want it to be too big on one side and too thin on the other. Once it's ready, just throw it on the pan. This pan is on a 4 out of 6, so medium, high fire. Depending on your pan, you might be able to skip the oil, but I think it gives a bit of a nice flavor. You don't have to use a lot of it. I just like to move my patties around, get a bit of that oil that it will brown them a bit nicer. After a while, you can flip them. Of course, you will notice they start getting this brown color. The patties are kind of soft. They won't fall apart, but you will notice it's not that firm as a usual meat hamburger would be. When I first made this recipe, I was a bit worried they would just crumble apart because it does feel like they are a bit too soft. But once you cook them evenly from both sides, then you will notice they stay together quite nicely. How long you want to cook them is completely up to you. I usually cook them until they get this brown golden color on both sides, and at that point you can take them out. Usually I would set them aside, place them on a plate with some kitchen paper. Making the patties is quite simple. At this point they're ready to be served. The way I would serve my patties is throwing them into the caldillo and then taking them out right away with a spoon. We just want to get some of that sauce. We want to get them to soak some of that. Then you can just serve them on a plate with some white rice. I like having them like this, but you could also make a hamburger with them or serve them however you prefer. I really like this dish because it's very cheap to make many of these patties, and especially if you like spinach, this is a perfect option for you. This is how I make the spinach patties. This is quite simple. They're also quite cheap if you're trying to save some money. I'm gonna show you how they're in the inside. You can see the cheese comes quite nicely. They're a great option, really cheap, really tasty. I hope you like them. Try it at home, press like, activate the bell, subscribe, share it with your friends, write any questions or comment below, and see you in the next one.